Hi everyone, I'm Dale Smith, aka Journo Dale, and we're here to talk about Canadian politics. All right, I'm here this week with Jessica Davis. She's the president of Insight Threat Intelligence and a former CSIS analyst. And hi, Jess. Nice to have you on the show.
Good to be here.
So something that's really been occupying some attention for the last few weeks has been the way in which financial tools were used during the occupation in Ottawa. And this was the freezing of bank accounts and so on. And you do a lot with this kind of financing issue, whether it's terrorist financing or whatnot. You wrote a book on terrorist financing. And so I thought I'd get your thoughts on the use of these tools and what we've learned from that.
Yeah, absolutely. So maybe I'll just start off a little bit with a bit of an overview about what the tools were and how they were used. So what we saw with the emergency measures were a lot of financial tools, as you mentioned. It was really focused on freezing the bank accounts of the individuals involved in the protest. And what ended up happening is that this was targeted primarily at the organizers of the protest. When the emergency order first came out, it wasn't really clear who was going to be targeted. There was some discussion about maybe seizing funds as well. In the end, it was really a freeze order on the accounts of mostly main organizers. It was implemented through an RCMP list. So the RCMP compiled a list of individuals that it decided were the main organizers or the main ringleaders of the protest or influencers. I've heard them use that language as well. And they passed that.
It was a very online event.
Yeah, exactly. So really recognizing that online aspect. And they passed that information on to financial institutions, banks, other financial entities, where those, and they passed it on, as far as I understand, very broadly. So they hadn't identified the specific institutions where those targeted individuals had accounts. Instead, that information was passed broadly. The second piece of it that's quite interesting is that we subsequently learned that some financial institutions were also proactive in identifying accounts of individuals involved. What we know so far is that that proactive identification of accounts and freezing of them was a very minor piece of the emergency measures, but it did occur.
Okay. So let's talk a little bit about how novel this particular use of these tools was. It's not something I've ever heard of previously, but you're in this world more than I am. So is this something that they just adapted from an existing tool, or was this something that was fairly new?
I think it depends a little bit on how you think about it.
Okay.
The ability to freeze accounts is a long-standing tool in Canadian law enforcement, the Canadian law enforcement arsenal. But it's usually and almost exclusively done with a court order. So you would have to go to a judge and say, we have reasonable grounds to believe or suspect that these funds need to be frozen for particular reasons. In this case, what the order really did was it circumvented that judicial process. So the RCMP didn't have to provide any justification really for that. Now, from what I understand, they did have some minor amounts of justification there, but they really were able to basically use tools and powers without that judicial oversight, which is quite unusual, and certainly starts to butt up against charter rights. And this is one of the arguments.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And I guess with that in mind, I would imagine that they would have still had at least some kind of a paper trail or due diligence, because questions would obviously be asked after the fact. What have you heard about that kind of aspect of it?
So we haven't heard very much about what kind of due diligence or justification was provided. I think that's the kind of thing that we're going to learn a bit more about during the inquiry, which is, going to be struck sometime over the next month, in the next month. So we're going to start to see some of that. The one piece of, that the RCMP has been talking about that hasn't received a lot of play, and I think this is actually kind of a critical part, is the information sharing. So what the RCMP has said is that the emergency measures facilitated information sharing with banks and financial institutions and other financial entities in a way that existing legislation does not allow in Canada. We have pretty strict rules about that.
Okay.
So it's really quite an interesting thing. The RCMP can't just go to any bank and say, Jessica Davis, she's a subject of investigation. You should give me the information that you have on her. That's not how that works.
No.
But in this case, that's kind of what happened. And that's kind of how it worked. So it was really an information sharing piece. And that touches on some challenges in the terrorist financing and extremist financing space that we have in Canada, just that, in short, it's difficult for banks and other financial entities to identify suspicious transactions relating to terrorist financing because it looks so much just like everyday activity. One of the solutions to that problem has been argued that there should be enhanced information sharing, like the sharing of names of subjects of investigation. So I'm curious to see whether or not an argument is now made that this is an important tool. Again, charter implications, I think.
For sure.
And all that kind of stuff, but very interesting space.
I guess one of the other implications that would trigger for me was also privacy implications. And I know that FINTRAC has a close relationship with the privacy commissioner as a result of that. And is this something that would need to be broader, I guess, if there is any kind of move to make these powers more permanent for FINTRAC?
Yeah, I think the FINTRAC piece is a bit of a question mark in my mind because I've been reviewing a lot of the testimony over the last few days, and it's not clear to me that FINTRAC received more information as a result of this.
Okay.
What seems to have happened is that it was the RCMP and potentially CSIS who were the beneficiaries of the information directly from the financial institutions. Now, this is one of those, I want to put a big asterisk next to it because we just don't know.
Yeah.
The information that FINTRAC seems to have gotten is about the crowdfunding companies and the payment processors and the registration of that. So that's my understanding at the moment. But yeah, it's like a super evolving space. In terms of what FINTRAC would need and if it is getting enhanced powers or information sharing, I think we're going to have to wait and see what the review of their activity says. So NCIRA has indicated an interest in reviewing FINTRAC as part of its mandate. So I think that sometime over the next few years, who knows when that will actually be struck. And I'm certainly not privy to when that's going to happen, but, it's on the list of things to do, as is every agency and department that hasn't been reviewed as part of our national security infrastructure. So I think they're going to have something to say about that. And yes, certainly the privacy commissioner, depending on what information FINTRAC is getting and whether or not it actually fits under their reporting requirements and whether or not they're getting more information than they should be getting. Right.
Okay. I think one of the other kind of subplots of this whole occupation was the invention of Brienne and this kind of almost information or psyops around small donors who were allegedly being targeted. And I just wonder if you had any particular thoughts on this particular use, because Brienne's story was even mentioned by one of those far-right European members of the European Parliament last week in their condemnation of Justin Trudeau. So that had reach. And I wonder if you can just give me some thoughts on what this kind of implication is.
There are so many things in this space that I think are so interesting. I think the invention of Brienne is one thing. There's also been a number of individuals associated with the convoy or involved in it in some way who've claimed to have their accounts frozen, but it's not always clear to me that that's actually happened. There's a lot of reasons why your account might be frozen or you might not be able to access funds, namely that you don't actually have any funds in your account. And I think there's been a bit of a confusion around that. But the invention of Brienne was really, to my mind, a very targeted piece of misinformation meant to exacerbate concerns with the emergency orders. And the interesting thing about it is that those are legitimate concerns. They're actually concerns that I raised right as soon as we saw the emergency orders coming out. There's this whole conversation around unintended consequences of those. Can a mother get child support? Can people pay their rent? All of these things. Those were very real concerns that were not addressed in the emergency orders. So Brienne, the invention of that really played to those fears in a way that I think was very effective. Obviously not true at the end of the day, but I think a lot of it there is responsibility on the government side for this because they were just not fast enough with the sharing of information and clarity around the implementation of those regulations. Yes, it was an emergency situation, but if you're going to use a huge hammer like this, you're going to have to be super clear about how it's being deployed.
Okay. And my last question is actually changing topic a little bit, is on the sanctions that we've been placing on Russia and Belarus the last few weeks. There's been some discussion online about the enforcement thereof and why enforcement matters rather than just putting people on a list. And I'm wondering if you can just give me some general thoughts as to why that is an important part of the conversation.
We have a huge problem in Canada with the enforcement of financial crimes and our financial crime legislation. And so when I talk about that, I think, money laundering, terrorist financing, certainly, but sanctions and economic measures. The problem, to my mind, really seems to revolve around a lack of expertise in terms of investigation and, identification of assets. And this is going to be even worse in the Russia context because Russia and, Russian actors and Russian associated actors are all really, really good at hiding their assets. You're not going to find a lot of assets in Putin's name.
Yeah.
That's not how he rolls. That's not what he does. Him and a lot of the people that he's associated with are using, shell companies, front companies, third parties, friends and family members. They're using all of these different tools to hide their actual ownership of the assets. In a lot of cases, you may not even actually be able to trace real ownership back to them. The ownership trail may stop at a friend or family member, but there's an understanding between the targeted individual and the person who controls the assets that they're actually the other persons. So I think that the lack of financial investigation expertise in this country is going to really hinder our ability to detect any of those assets. And we just haven't made it a priority over the last number of years. There's very few people in government who can do this work, and even fewer who are assigned to do it full time.
Well, all right. That's on that cheery note. Thanks so much for taking the time to do this. I appreciate it. And we'll do this again sometime.
Absolutely. Thanks for letting me deep dive on this issue.
Thanks.
And that's everything for this week. Join us again next week for some more Canadian politics. I'm Dale Smith. That's at journo_Dale on Twitter. And don't forget to like the video, share, subscribe, and support us on Patreon. Thanks, everyone.